So before we get on to the third part of a variable, which is the value, we're going to take a step back and we're going to learn how to actually add our variables into our programs. And in order to do that, we need to define them. And what that means is we need to essentially announce to the rest of our program that from now on, treat this identifier as a variable. Treat it as, whenever you see this identifier, substitute that name with the true value that is held within the variable. So this process is called defining or declaring. And essentially what we're doing is we're adding a new keyword to the JavaScript dictionary. That dictionary that says whether any word that we use in our program is valid or not. We're making our own valid words, almost like the Urban Dictionary. We're kind of adding our own stuff to it. So when we want to define a variable inside of our programs, we have to do it at a very specific spot and in a specific order for a very specific reason. If I go to use a word from a dictionary that doesn't actually exist in the dictionary, nobody's going to know what I'm talking about. So for the same reason in our programs, we can't just start using these words if we haven't yet defined them. So defining is a process that must occur near the top of the program. And in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to put it at the very top of our program, right above our main draw code inside of our main.js. If you're not working in that, you're just working in your own JavaScript file, just put it near the top somewhere. And the reason being is that we must define it. We must add it to that JavaScript dictionary before we start to use it, before we start to add values into it, or before we start to try and display the values. We need to define it before we use it. As we recall, our programs run from top to bottom. To define a variable, it's actually a very straightforward process, thankfully. It makes our lives just a little bit easier. So let's give you a little bit of an analogy. And this is the best analogy I can think of for a variable, or defining a variable. It's like calling up your favorite restaurant and saying, I'd like to reserve a table for 5. And that's it. That's essentially what the process of defining a variable is like. It's like you're reserving space for future content. The future content in that analogy being yourself and your family or whoever else you're going out to dinner with. In variables terms, we're reserving space, and instead of at a restaurant, we're reserving space in our RAM, in our memory. We're saying, allot this amount of space for us. When we get there, we're going to populate that space. In the restaurant, it means we're going to sit down at the table. In our program, it means we're going to put a value inside that RAM location, inside that memory location. So it's just like reserving a table at a restaurant. It remains empty until we decide to populate it. So the process of defining a variable inside of JavaScript is very straightforward. We need a new keyword, which is the keyword var. And of course, that is short for variable. The next piece is the easiest piece, is an identifier. So some name that represents what that variable is going to hold. So the past examples we've been using username. So let's continue with that. So if I had a variable and I called it username using proper camel case, I put my semicolon at the end there, and that's telling JavaScript that I am done defining my variable. Now go reserve the space, go reserve the table at the restaurant. Okay? That's it. That's all it takes. We just need to have that identifier. You'll notice that we haven't specified a type, and that is for a very specific reason. JavaScript is a special language in how it handles variables. And most programming languages are defined in two aspects, or one major aspect that separates them. They're either a strongly typed language or a weakly typed language. The difference being that a weakly typed language doesn't know what type of data a variable is on its creation. So as the program executes, when we populate that variable, when we sit down at the table at the restaurant, that's when the data type is decided upon. So later on, if I try and store the value Steve inside of username, it now knows that username is to be considered a string variable. And if I try and store the value 11, just the number 11, it's going to treat username like a number type. Now, of course, that wouldn't make sense being with the identifier username, but that's not the point. The computer doesn't register the fact that username represents a string. All it knows is that it has an identifier, and it's going to populate it with a value. So we have to make sure that we're keeping track and we use proper variable names, and we use that throughout the whole program. No spelling mistakes or anything like that. It is case sensitive. We got to make sure that the name should reflect what we're actually using it for. Now back to the strongly typed versus weakly typed. So JavaScript, as I said, is a weakly typed language, which means it'll essentially decide upon the type of data when we start throwing values into it. In other languages, things like Java or C#, those languages are strongly typed languages. And what that means is that when we define the variable, we have to specify the type. And for the rest of the life of the program, that type is known to be, or that variable is known to be of that type, even from the very get-go, during its first creation. So just do another example for a variable. Let's do var rec area. This, of course, is representing the area of a rectangle, rec area. It's very clear. I know exactly what it represents. There's no questioning. And that's all there is to defining or declaring a variable. There's no extra steps at this point.